This is a graphical representation of the model that I developed based on all of my research in this area. Let me just take you through it for a moment because we're going to be spending a lot of time with this model. We're going to see lots of different representations of it, but this will be the core. Every representation we see of it will always have this component, this set of components as you see them right now. So first of all, if you see down here, we have least effective, and over here we have most effective. Well, the reason that you see that is because it is actually a continuum. It goes from left to right, and at any given time, you are somewhere on this continuum. So your awareness may be here, or it may be here, or it may be here, as an example. Notice that there's two major categorizations on this, symbolic and non-symbolic. These are two different big catch-alls for types of consciousness. Right now, all of us, most likely, are in symbolic consciousness. This is everyday waking consciousness. And it's the consciousness of symbols. That's why it's called symbolic consciousness. We think in symbols. Really, everything that we do, everything that we represent the world with, it's all in symbols. And so it's a very symbol-based and thus symbolic form of consciousness. If you want to think of it very simply, just think of it as this is your normal, everyday, waking consciousness. Now, this also includes when you're dreaming. It doesn't just include when you're waking. It includes waking, dreaming, and it may or may not include deep sleep. There's a little bit of contradictory evidence on that. As I record this right now, there is some evidence that deep sleep is in fact not totally dreamless. And if it's not totally dreamless, then obviously it's going to have symbolic elements in it. Now, on the far right side, we have non-symbolic consciousness. Non-symbolic consciousness goes by many different names. You see some of the examples here are unity, post-symbolic, and non-dual. Really, the terms for these depend on the tradition that someone is a part of. So if you're a Christian, you may think of these as mystical states of consciousness. If you're a Buddhist, you may think of them differently. You may think of them as enlightenment states of consciousness. If you're a Zen practitioner, you may prefer the term non-dual. There's all sorts of different ways to represent this consciousness, but in essence, notice that it's non-symbolic. It's a big contrast between symbolic and non-symbolic consciousness. There is no way to really fully embrace non-symbolic consciousness and to talk about it without using language, without using symbols. But this state of consciousness is a state of consciousness that is described as basically being beyond all language, being beyond all symbolic representations. It is basically a pure form of awareness, you often hear it referred to, or feeling as a deep sense of unity with everything. Really no distinctions between yourself and anything else. It's just one big unity experience. We'll pick up on more of the non-symbolic type of ideas as we go through a later session, a later training session. But for right now, I'm just trying to sort of get you oriented on the model, just trying to get you to see what's what so that it doesn't look like just sort of this big confusing graphic. Now, as you might guess, from the least effective on the left to the most effective on the right, one of the things that my research uncovered is that the more you are in non-symbolic consciousness, the more effective you seem to be in terms of mind-matter interaction. I have all kinds of different things to share with you in regards to this, but we're just going to keep it very simple right now because we just want to sort of get you an overview of this model. Now you'll notice along the top you see things like visualization, emotion, release, and surrender. Well, visualization plus emotion, you should recognize if you've ever done anything with power of thought, with new thought, with law of attraction. This is the core of those types of ideas. It's the idea that you visualize what you want. Sometimes you also do that with emotion. Notice that there's some little dashed lines in here. The model, as represented in this particular version of it, has three pieces, and there's two dashed lines separating the three different chunks. Visualization plus emotion, notice that it extends just past that first segment. And then you have release starting to extend just a little bit into the first segment, but really primarily taking up all of the second segment. And then you have surrender taking up a little bit of the second segment and all of the third segment. These are our three primary meta tools to work with. So on the far left of the model, the least effective is the power of thought type stuff that you're familiar with, probably from a law of attraction, the secret type of materials. So you have visualization plus emotion, which is pretty much as far as those materials go. Sometimes they go a little bit into the idea of release, but what release means is never really covered. And in fact, it took me over a year to start to differentiate release in any way that I could experimentally play with it. Likewise, it took me a good amount of time to realize that release and surrender were in fact two very different things. So as we move from the left to the right in the model, we see that on the left we have primarily new thought type ideas with visualization plus emotion and a little release being brought in. And in the middle we have what are really sort of often called energy psychology type ideas these days. There's like energy psychology conferences and stuff. And it's all tools that deal with how do you release. Now that release can be emotional, that release can be from thought, cognitive we'd call it. Release. And then the third last little segment over there is surrender. And surrender is a category all itself, which we're definitely not going to spend a lot of time talking about in this session. Most people are going to be on the far left side of this model. So when I say that everyone has a state of consciousness and everybody has a place on this model at any given point, most people are going to be down around this area right here. Now, that may be surprising to you since there are so many different locations on this model. But the reality is that the reason the power of thought techniques that are popular are the ones that are like law of attraction related power of thought techniques is because most people are on this far left side. And so if there's going to be any sort of even spotty results, you're probably going to luck into using a technique that'll work at least a little bit sometimes if you're fishing around on the far left side of this model, if you're just sort of an ordinary person that's out there. Now, if you've spent a lot of time doing psychological, personal growth, personal development type of things, spiritual practices, and I don't really care what spiritual religious practices it is, then you're going to most likely find yourself as somewhere in this middle section here. Either just to this side of the line, or somewhere in this middle section, probably up to just before this part. If you're enlightened, right, then you've crossed that second dashed line, and you're into the third part and the final part of the model. But again, we're going to treat that differently, and we're gonna look at it later. And I'm going to be calling this area in general over here, this third section, non-symbolic consciousness. So now that you've got that there's three main sections and you've got some of the components associated with this, and we can kind of navigate around this a little bit, let me make a couple of things clear. First of all, because you have a place somewhere on this model, there are techniques that will work for you. Now, as you might imagine, if the techniques and you are located on the left side of the model, it will be less effective than if you're closer to the right side of the model. But you should nonetheless be able to find some techniques. In a later graphic, one of the things that you'll see is that we'll add in various techniques. So if you're in this area, you'll have a sample of techniques to use. And if you're in this area, you'll have another sample of techniques to use. And so on and so forth. If a technique does not work, you should stop using it. If you've given a technique a week or two and you're not seeing at least a little action from it, at least a little benefit from it, even if you're on the far left side of the model, dump that technique and move on. So techniques should work, or you should move on and try another one. There's a flip side to this, and that is it's very dangerous to use the wrong techniques. So if you're trying to use some sort of visualization technique and you're not having any luck with it, it could actually be far worse than that. What my research has basically uncovered is that you have a situation where techniques have both beneficial and non-beneficial aspects to them. If a technique matches up with you, you should be able to at least get some sort of mind-matter interaction effect from it. If it doesn't match up with you, then you have a situation where continuing to use it can produce absolute train wrecks in your life. And as I was going through the research with my various research groups, I actually reached points where research had to be stopped because of the detrimental effects that were being produced. It took me a while to catch on to the fact that one size didn't fit all. What I originally set out to do was to just sort of start going through each of the techniques, starting with sort of the traditional law of attraction, visualizing type techniques, and putting a group of people through them, seeing how they did. And then from that, I'd assumed that I could either rule that in as an effective technique or rule it out as a not effective technique. Well, I wound up being completely wrong in those assumptions. And it turns out that it's not about effective or ineffective as a technique. That's a very small part of it. I mean, of course, there are effective and ineffective techniques, but it has to be effective for the individual. So when I had a group of people, and I had people that were trying all to use the same technique, and maybe I would have one of them producing just amazing results, and then another 5 or 6 that were just having train wrecks occur in their life, just, horrible, horrible things happening in their life. And that would be the point at which I'd say, okay, well, we have to stop this for you folks, and the one that worked for you can keep using it if you want. But I kept, in some cases, the same research subjects, and I kept them between different experiments. And I began to notice that when those research participants went to the next one, they might be the one that had it work for them. So over time, I began to notice that techniques weren't generically effective or ineffective, that techniques were specifically effective for people for some reason. And at that time, I really didn't have any idea why. I was, still at a very early stage and still pretty lost in the dark. Eventually, I was able to move enough people between enough of these little experimental groups that I was able to find that there was something that would work for everyone. It was just a question of finding what it was that would work for that person. And once I had that, I was basically able to reverse engineer the process from there and to look at the people in the groups and to say, okay, what is it that you people have in common? So in some instances, I used psychological measures. In some instances, I used interviews. I spent an enormous amount of time with all of these people, and I was just basically trying to figure out what is it that these people in this group have in common that would make them successful with this technique, where for other people, at best, it might not be effective, and at worst, it might be just producing absolute train wrecks in their lives. So from that, I basically backed out, first of all, this model, this idea that there's a continuum. I began to notice that these different techniques could be cataloged and categorized in different ways. So some of them were just visualization, some of them were visualization with emotion, some of them were visualization with emotion and release, some of them were primarily release in all kinds of different ways, and some of them dealt with surrender in all kinds of different ways. So once I saw that, I thought, okay, well, there's different types of methods. Then I was able to basically match up where people were at with those methods, and what fell out of it is the continuum that you see in front of you. So a group of people that all share one place on this continuum have the most success with a certain type of technique. And it really is that simple. You know, that's the great thing about doing research. Usually once you figure something out and you have great success with it, it winds up being incredibly simple. Of course, the hitch with that is that, you know, it's enormous amounts of time and effort and dedication and thought and analysis and everything else, and frustration, frankly, and lots of times just throwing your hands up and saying, geez, I don't even know where to go from here, before you finally reach that point, before you finally reach that simplification. So what you see on this continuum, what you see here between the symbolic and the non-symbolic is a gradient, right? And the more you go to this side, the more symbolic consciousness, that's what's represented here, the more symbolic consciousness you're operating from. Now, you're never operating purely from symbolic consciousness. There's always a little bit of non-symbolic that's possible to peek through. Conversely, if you move all the way down here, you're operating primarily from non-symbolic. So this is a continuum. And as you move through, there does seem to be some sort of growth or some sort of development that accompanies this. Now, what's interesting about that is that if you have techniques, like let's say you're positioned here, and you're using the techniques that are associated with this area on the model, you will change over time. So it's possible that as you continue to use those techniques, if you're very diligent about using those techniques, if you really incorporate them into your life, one of the things that you'll notice is that they will actually become less effective. This is another one of those things that really puzzled me. It took me a while to figure out why I was having some of my longer-term research people actually having techniques that had worked very well for them becoming less effective. And what I wound up basically figuring out was that they were moving along this continuum. That if I would give them another technique in this range, so down in here, they would essentially be very effective again. Things would work for them again. And so some things were becoming less effective, other things were becoming more effective. And the movement, incidentally, can go both ways. There were some people who regressed and who had less effective, who moved into sort of the less effective types of techniques as being more effective for them than the things that were working for them before that were up here. But the majority of people moved this way. So the majority of people seem to move towards this non-symbolic side of the continuum.